Hi everyone, welcome back to another class with Bodhi Tree Buddhism, where we continue on with reading The Way to Buddhahood by Venerable Master In Shun. Recently, the class has been a little bit irregular, but we're still ticking along. So last week, we got into the first of the four holy truths. So if you recall, we're in that section where we're talking about the teachings common to the three different vehicles or means to liberation. So the paths of those who seek their own liberation as arahats, worthy ones. Those who seek liberation as pratyeka Buddhas or individual solitary Buddhas, solitary awakened ones. And of course, the path of the Bodhisattvas towards the full awakening of a Buddha. And so within the common elements of all these teachings, one of the core ideas is the principle of dependent origination. And the classic example of this principle of dependent origination is the four holy truths. So we talked a little bit about how the four and their structure and their relationship from dissatisfaction and the causes of dissatisfaction, which are the first two truths. And then the third and fourth truths, which are the cessation of dissatisfaction, which basically is liberation, it's nirvana. And last but definitely not least, the path that leads to the cessation of dissatisfaction. So basically, how to get out of this predicament that we're in as samsaric living beings. And we talked about all the sort of core elements of those four truths. And then we got into where are we? Should be here. Then we got into the truth of dissatisfaction. We talked about the 8 dissatisfactions, not attaining what you want, getting stuck with what you don't want, getting separated from the things that you love, birth, old age, disease, and death. And then the sort of last really broad principle of the 5 aggregates. We talked a little bit about this idea of 5 aggregates of grasping, or these 5 aggregates, which are kind of like the fuel that underlie this whole embodiment in samsara. From there, we talked a little bit about the 5 aggregates in detail, going through all 5 of them: physical form, sensation, perception, volition, and cognition. And so these are, this is like this 5-fold analysis of basically what makes up any living being from the physical bodies. It's kind of interesting. I always think that only 1 out of the 5 is the physical aspect. And then the other 4 are what we might call mental or non-physical. Sensations are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Perceptions, when we identify things, we see things, we say, this is a microphone, this is a computer, and lots of concepts involved. Volitions, which are kind of the emotional forces, the drivers, wanting to grasp at things and wanting to reject things, and all sorts of other emotions. And it's within that element there, that aggregate, that we also include the basic principle of karma. And last but not least, cognition, which is usually translated as consciousness. And I think last time I talked a little bit about why I really don't like that term consciousness to translate it. One is it's an abstract singular thing. And that very much goes against the Buddhist principle of this idea here in Sanskrit, vijnana, because there are multiple cognitions. So if I'm looking at the screen right now, this is a visual cognition, and then I can hear some background noise. This is an auditory, like a cognition of sound. And each one of these is a different kind of cognition. And that's the way we need to understand it, not in the sense of like this sort of universal generalized consciousness where I'm conscious of all these things, and then we have this abstract singular sense of consciousness. It's very much against this Buddhist way of talking about this particular mental element that constitutes who we are as embodied beings. And then the last line here for verse 68 was talking about seizing cognition abides in many locations, tainted grasping, unable to be freed. So basically, we have these senses and we're constantly contacting these different things. We are constantly seeing things, hearing things. We're getting different sensations from those. We're having then volitions towards them, grasping at this and grasping at that. The pleasant things, we grab at them. The unpleasant things, we reject them. We also have from the perceptions and the concepts. Based on that, we also grasp and reject. Tainted grasping, all of this clinging and also rejection, like not just desire, but also aversion, this kind of counter. we're unable to be freed. And this is going on like literally moment by moment within our lives, and not just when we were awake. Think all the crazy dreams, the things we grab at and reject in our dreams too. Now, the next line here, the next verse, verse 69, just sort of, this is kind of like a bit of a abbreviated form. So let's just read it, and then we'll talk about the content here. 自福有六处，取境而生事. This in turn is due to the 6 sense organs, which seize upon objects, giving rise to cognitions. Yeah, and here's another example. It should be in the plural. So this here is referring back to the cognition here, the seizing cognition here. So this is, and this verse, half of a verse, only like 2 little parts here, we can also take as talking about one of the other ways that Buddhism classically analyzes like embodied existence. So we have the 5 aggregates. It's probably the most classic form and really good form, really good way of analyzing the different elements that make up our life. But there's another couple. One uses a 12-fold form and one uses an 18-fold form. And so the 12-fold form basically talks about the sense organs and the sense objects. So we can analyze our experience in terms of the physical eye and then the objects that we see. Ear, sense of hearing, and the things that we hear. Likewise, nose and smells, tongue and tastes, tactile objects and our sense of touch, and also the mind and the objects of the mind. And then there's another format which uses 18, which is basically just the same 12, but instead of just having the objects and the senses, we also then have the cognitions that correspond to them. So there's visual objects, there's the physical eye as an organ, and then there's visual cognition, like seeing. Likewise, there's a sound. So sound's kind of like this thing outside of myself, as it were. I have an ear, a functioning sense organ, and then I have this cognition of a sound. So there's a hearing. So this is what we've got here, and it just talks about those. So the first line, due to the 6 sense organs, and then which seize upon objects, so 取境. So 取 here just means to, it can be like to seize upon, but it can just mean to take an object. So you have to be a little bit careful there. And why do we have to be careful? Because like seizing, like we use the English word seizing, and often this Chinese term here, 取, has got this negative sense. It's an affliction that we want to get rid of, grasping desire. So obviously we don't want that. But we also got to keep in mind that for somebody who's liberated, their sense organs still work. So, the Buddha still sees things. The Buddha still has physical eyes and he sees objects. And so what happens for him? Well, he also still has a visual cognition. And we would still use the same term here, 取境. And there it's not seizing as in like a afflicted state. We might just take it as take objects, or like set upon objects, right? So the Buddha's eyes take up visual objects, and this gives rise to various forms of visual cognition. So we do have to be a little bit careful about that term there, whether or not this is like a value judgment, like is this a bad thing that we don't want to have in, or is this just talking about this kind of neutral process of cognizing objects? So this one here, under this heading, 6 sense organs, 6 cognitions, is just talking about basically a slightly different focus and way of analysis. Instead of the 5 aggregates form, it's talking about how the senses operate. And this is like super important when it comes to Buddhist practice, being aware of the functioning of our senses, because this is kind of the basic start point for a lot of this sort of craving and grasping, rejection and jealousy, pride, hatred, blah, blah, blah. We do have one more form of analysis before you can maybe see creeping down the bottom of the screen here. This is the second noble truth here. So we're going to get to that in a second, but we're just going to do one more form of analysis here, which is the 6 elements. Now, this is really an analysis based on the physical aspects. So we've got the 5 aggregates, remember, and only the first one is the physical and then 4 mental. We've got this 12-fold or 18-fold analysis based on the sense organs. Now remember there too, I mean, we've got 6 sense organs, right? 5 out of 6 of them are physical. So our physical eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body are all physical. The mind is the 6th sense organ, is of course not physical. The objects of the 5 physical sense organs are also physical. So sights, sounds, smells, taste, and tactile objects. But of course, mental objects are not. So this kind of got a balance also. But when it comes to this one here of the 6 elements, these are all physical elements. So let's just read the verse and quickly move through this part of the text, shall we? 或六界和合，世间苦为二. Or the union of the 6 elements, mundane dissatisfaction is merely so. Okay, that last line is sort of like super summary there, isn't it? Now, this idea of the 6 elements, there's actually a couple of different systems in Buddhist traditions. The first 4 are very standard: earth, water, fire, and air. Earth, water, fire, and air. And I always find it interesting with these 4 because it's just kind of standard in not just Buddhism, but other forms of Indian religious philosophy. But like many very old, like little pre-modern kind of philosophy, shall we say, also have a very similar form. This idea of, there's earth, there's water, there's fire, there's air. So it appears in, in Europe, it appears in East Asia. There are some other different versions, like the Chinese has one with 5 and not just 6. It's got wood, so wood and metal, which kind of corresponds to like the earth element. It's kind of fascinating. I mean, and a number of people have tried to sort of connect this with like modern sciences and sort of this idea of that. When we talk about physical things, we talk about 3 phases. We talk about a solid phase, a liquid phase, and a gaseous phase. And of course, the difference between these is simply how much heat energy is in them. You take a block of ice, you warm it up, it becomes liquid water. You heat it up, it hits 100 degrees, and it becomes gaseous water vapor. So, that's kind of interesting. But you do have to note that earth, water, and air, the definitions of them in these classic Indian religious senses, including Buddhism, they don't really directly correspond to what we would nowadays in say physics or chemistry talk about as solid, liquid, and gas. Okay, so there are some superficial similarities, but not really. So that's the first 4, but you've still got another 2. And for these other 2, there are some differences and different approaches. Some systems don't use 6 elements, they use 5. One of them is what we might call space. So space is in many systems kind of defined as you've got to have space in order to have like, say, like material objects and occupy that space. But some do they make a distinction between 2 different types of space. One is this kind of like, so like if you just think around you, all the space around you and your body is occupying space, right? And then the table or the computer in front of you or your phone or a tree or a car or a building is all occupying space. But then they have another definition, which is kind of helpful. I'll pick up an old glass. So like, there's this empty space inside your cup here. And that's another form of what we might call limited space. Now, of course, one of the differences is that the ancient people didn't know that, nowadays we say, from a physics point of view, you say, well, yeah, I mean, you're solid, but it's got the space here, but that's full of gas. But these ancient people didn't think that way. They didn't realize that all this space around us is still occupied with this physical thing called gaseous form. So that kind of space is kind of like holes in the things. So this concept, to be honest, for me personally, I don't know how useful it is for our analysis of the world. And then what about number 6? So here's where the difference comes in. Some systems, some teachings, the sutras use light. They talk about light as kind of the 6th element. And so, light is light shining on me, shines on things, okay, just light. And other systems use this idea of consciousness or cognition. And cognition then becomes the 6th element. So if we think of it like that, and we use cognition as the 6th, and a kind of a slightly actually simpler model, which is just like the 4 physical elements, earth, water, fire, and air, and then we have cognition. It's just a different form of analysis of the world, but it leans more heavily onto the physical side. And then just all the mental things, all the intangible things just get lumped together as cognition. So that's just basically all the system is for. So mundane dissatisfaction is merely so. The idea here being all these things we've talked about. We can talk about dissatisfaction as the 8 forms from, birth, old age, disease, and death, not getting what you want, being stuck with things you don't want, being separated from love things, the 5 aggregates of grasping, this just embodied existence within samsara, whether you want to analyze it as the 5 aggregates, you want to analyze it in terms of the sense organs and objects and cognitions, whether you want to analyze it by different elements. That's it, right? Worldly, samsaric, here on our screen, mundane, right? Mundane comes from the word is also worldly, from the Latin. Dissatisfaction. So mundane, worldly, samsaric, dissatisfaction, pain, and suffering. That's it. Like, it just, so long as you're embodied, you've kind of got that element going on. Okay, that's a real brief summary there of the first truth of dissatisfaction. Now we get into the truth of accumulation. We've kind of got a little bit more time. I don't know whether or not I want to start on this because, as you can see from the truth of accumulation, one of the first things we get into is karma. And this is such a big topic. We don't just have this verse here. We've also got like all different forms of analysis of karma here. It's quite detailed stuff. I think I'm going to jump into the first one. I'm going to read the first verse here, but next class we'll come back and do it in more detail. So, 苦生有业集，业集福有祸，发业与润生，缘会感苦果。The generation of dissatisfaction is due to the accumulation of karma. The accumulation of karma is, in turn, due to delusion, the activation of karma, and its nourishment. So the due to here is due to all these 3 things: delusion, activation, and nourishment. When conditions meet, they bring about the fruition or the result of dissatisfaction. Now, one thing to note in this verse here is the way in which we use this term karma. So sometimes we use karma in this really broad sense, whereby we're using it basically as a synonym for the second truth, right? So the technical term here in the 4 truths is samudaya, which is kind of like accumulation. And in Chinese, the Chinese translation using this term here, ji, it's gathering things together. Though often from Sanskrit or Pali, it gets translated something more like origin of something. But remember, in terms of dependent origination, it's talking about the cause. What's the cause of dissatisfaction? It's caused by samudaya, the accumulation or origin. And sometimes we use the term karma as this broad heading to cover all the things. But the second and third lines are actually a more detailed breakdown of what that entails. So it's kind of from delusion, ho, to the activation of karma, and then the nourishment. You got to kind of, there are things that kind of keep it going and ticking over in order to generate that result. So you do have to be a bit careful when you're talking about karma, if we're talking about it in a broad sense or a narrow sense. Okay, so that's just the first point to mention here. So this term karma, I think we've touched on it earlier, comes from a root, like a verbal root, kr. So we spell like kr with a dot above it. That dot is that kind of rolled tongue there, kr. And kr just kind of is a verb that just means work or action. So, the word karma is now already part of the English language. It's in English dictionaries. Sometimes, though, you have to be careful because, sometimes, I don't know, do we want to translate it, or do we want to, like keep it as this term karma? So when we keep it as karma, we can keep it as like this sort of very technical, like Buddhist or Hindu term. But also when we translate it, it sometimes just reminds us, action. But we also have to be very careful about what kind of action. There are certain kinds of actions that really wouldn't be karma. And elsewhere, we have this definition of karma as being intentional action. So cetana. So this term cetana comes from chit, which is like mind. Basically, it means when there's action that's driven by some kind of mental or emotional or even intellectual force, then it can be considered as karma. Now, often even this idea, so about Buddhism, it's like, oh, it's action, karma is action, but it has to be intentional action. But you have to be really careful about this term intentional. Like if you think even in English, like in a legal system, not an illegal system, so if something happened and it was like, you might say it's like unintentional, would that still be karma? But, or you say something like, oh, but I had good intentions, but it led to a really bad result. How does that work out for karma? So what is meant by intention doesn't just mean like, oh, I had good intentions, like, wholesome intentions, but a good result. Also, your understanding of something still counts for that intention. So if you thought that, I'm trying to think of something, like so say the idea of like in Chinese Buddhism, this idea of like life release, where people take like they take birds or they take fish and they release them, that are caged, buy them in the market, they release them back into the environment. So this is like, it's good karma because it's like a caged or captured animal. So in ancient times, these would have been animals at the market that were going to be slaughtered, right? So you've set them free, you've like given them life, good karma, very good karma. Now there's a whole big other topic that we can talk about some other day, but sometimes people do very silly things. They get like saltwater fish and then they release them back into freshwater streams, or they take some like a turtle from some other environment and they release it back into a different environment, and then it becomes like an environmental like hazard. And you say, well, I had a good intention. It's not just your intention to like, my intention was to save the life of this animal, but you had a wrong understanding. You really messed it up. You didn't understand what was going on. You didn't understand what that animal needed. You didn't understand the environment. That's ignorance. And ignorance, or wise, clear knowledge or understanding, is also part of what we mean by intentional. So it's not enough to just say you do something stupid with a good intention, therefore it's wholesome. Nope. Then you've got the situation of what we call like mixed karma or black and white karma. Elements of that action are wholesome. Elements are unwholesome in the sense that they're ignorant. And your result's going to also be kind of mixed as well. There's going to be kind of a good result, but also kind of a bad result too. So that's just something to keep in mind about this term karma, as, thought about in terms of intentional action. It's important to kind of keep this in mind. And one of the big things in Buddhism was that was defined really differently from some of the other religious traditions at the time of the Buddha. Say in Brahmanism, karma was action. So somebody who does a ritual, like a Brahmanic ritual, they chant the mantra, they make the right offerings, etc., etc. It didn't matter their intention behind it. The efficacy of that action was based on, did they do the ritual correctly? Their mental state, other than that, is secondary or is irrelevant. And then on the flip side was the Jains, who they would do things, and if they accidentally stood on a bug, that would still be, they didn't use the word karma, but that would still be like a really bad thing. They thought that the physical action was the most important, followed by the verbal action, and the mental driving force behind it was far less important. But for the Buddhists, it was the other way around. The mental force, the driving force behind it, was the most important thing. So let's just maybe wrap it up there for today, just talking about some of the ideas of karma. Next class, we'll come back and we'll talk more about the details here, the relationship between these three, and the relationship then between karma and its accumulation leading to the fruition of dissatisfaction. Okay, so thanks for coming along. Hopefully we'll get some more classes up sooner rather than later. And see you back here at Bodhi Tree Buddhism. Okay, catch you later.